Welcome everyone to Race in the Wild West, a conversation with Laura J. Arata and Lauren Francis Sharma. My name is China Reavers and I'm here on behalf of the Montana Book Festival, which wouldn't have been possible this year without the Whitefish Review and our other sponsors. We're really excited to welcome our authors to this year's virtual festival, but first I'd like to make a couple of announcements. I'd like to encourage you, our attendees, to submit your questions to our authors via the Q&A at the bottom of our screen. Colin Johnson is on hand to read your questions and pass them along to Laura and Lauren. Also use the chat function to talk amongst yourselves as the event is taking place. Colin will be monitoring both the Q&A and the chat for questions. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to our authors. Laura J. Arata received her PhD from Washington State University in 2014. She is a specialist in public history and the history of race and gender in the American West. Her book project, Race in the Wild West, Sarah Bickford and the Construction of Historical Memory in Virginia City, Montana, 1870 to 1930, focuses on 19th and 20th century Montana through the life of an African-American woman born a slave who played an instrumental role in developing tourism at the site of a well-known lynching. Her most recent work, Terror and Tourism, Lynching Legend in the Montana Vigilantes, appears in the Pacific Northwest Quarterly. Lauren Francis Sharma is the author of the critically acclaimed novel Till the Well Runs Dry. She resides near Washington, D.C. with her husband and 2 children and is the assistant director of the Bread Loaf Writers Conference. And with that, I'll let them take it away. Thanks, ladies.
Thank you. Hi, Laura. How are you?
Hi, how are you? I'm so excited to have a conversation about our books.
Yeah, me too. When I finished your book, I was like, I can't believe that we have these 2 stories to talk about in the same year. It's so strange, right? I mean, we're talking about 2 Black women in, Montana in the, sort of, I would say 19th century into the early 20th century, right? Yeah. So, both of our books, span a really lengthy, a lot of time. I think I sort of begin Rosa's journey, my character Rosa's journey, in the late 1700s, and Sarah's story begins when?
She's born just before the Civil War starts, so about a decade before the Civil War,
Right.
1850s.
Right, and so, and her story goes up until I think she passes away in the early 1930s or so. Yeah, so it's a really long stretch. So, I'm talking about your book, but nobody knows quite yet, about your book. So why don't you share a little bit about your story and how you stumbled upon Sarah Bickford?
Oh, I would be so honored. I'm so excited to be here. I am so excited to have our books side by side. There's so much I want to talk with you about. So I came to Sarah in the most sort of organic way. I had gone to Virginia City for a school, like a field school that was taking place during my master's program. I had no intention of writing about Virginia City or studying anything related to Virginia City. It was supposed to be like a 2-week thing. But I remember walking into this building, and I grew up in a really tiny town in California. We were very much steeped in that lore of the Wild West and cowboys and Indians and all of those things you think of when the Wild West comes to mind. And I remember walking into this building where they had this display of this famous lynching that happened that was, part of the Wild West lore of Montana, still very much is. And there was this little display buried in the back about the woman who owned it being a Black woman. And I thought, well, there has to be more to this story. There's got to be more to the story of why she would do that. And when I wrote my master's thesis, which was just about business in material culture in Virginia City, I couldn't find enough information about her to include her in the main text. She ended up in a footnote in my master's thesis. And that footnote haunted me for a couple of years while I was getting started on my PhD, which is Sarah deserves more than a footnote. Sarah deserves to have her entire story told. And just as, one kind of final note on that, I had some discouragement when I was getting started writing about her. There were a lot of people that said, well, I don't know if you'll find enough to write a whole book about her. And I think that's one of the things that we really need to engage and talk about, like elevating the stories of Black women in that time period in this country matters so much, and we need to not shy away from it because we're afraid they won't have left us the kinds of sources that historians a lot of times are comfortable working with. There's other information out there. So I would love to hear a little bit about how you came to Rosa's story, because I feel like in some ways I had the easier job here. I had to go like research Sarah and find everything I could, but then her story gave me the details that I needed to tell it. But you invented this whole incredible, rich, detailed world around Rosa's life. And I would love to hear more how you came to that.
Yeah, I kind of wish that I'd read your book before. Because funny, when I Rosa's, my character Rosa is from Trinidad. And when I decided to have her journey from Trinidad to Montana, I didn't come across very much to support sort of the possibility that there could have been Black people out there and, Black people making a life. Except when I did a little research, I found this wonderful Black Crow chief named Edward Rose, and he'd been part of the Crow Native American tribe, and when I found him and I read his story, which wasn't a very, very big story, right? Like we're talking just little snippets here and there, and then one, thank goodness, one historian actually wrote a very slim sort of book about Edward Rose's sort of life, and when I stumbled upon his story, I was like, there is my anchor for Rosa, and how she makes her way from this little island close to Venezuela to Montana, and it's quite a journey. But it actually came up. It was, strangely enough, I was driving to pick up my kids from school, and I was listening to Willie Nelson on Fresh Air, and and because my parents are West Indian, they listen to, like, older West Indians listen to a lot of country western music, and so I kind of grew up listening to Willie and Dolly and all those kind of older country western stars. And so listening to Willie was sort of reminding me of being home with my parents, and and watching westerns, which was really, really big in my home, and and just the whole idea of the West and what that meant. And it's sort of the exercise of writing the story was for me so exciting that, like, I got to write a story about someone that sort of looked like me, set in a place that I always wanted to write about and to read than anything. I wanted that. I wanted to be Laura Ingalls, right? So there was that excitement about it, but the historical part was the research part was no fun. I don't know how you do it, I have to say. So thank goodness there are historians out there. So
it's so interesting, though, because for a long time there just wasn't a lot written about African American people in the West, right? And then Quinard Taylor and some other historians, in whose footsteps I follow, came along and said, well, yes, there were actually lots of African Americans here, but the sources are not going to look the same as the sources we would normally draw upon to write the kinds of books to that point.
Go ahead.
I was writing about Sarah's story and then reading about Rosa. As I was reading about Rosa, I was like, I can see this as, right, a real historical. Of course, there were people from the West Indies and who would come up through Mexico and from all these different places in the West. And it just makes me think so much about how many more of them must be out there waiting. But sometimes when we don't have all the historical information we would like, this is exactly what we do. We create worlds around these characters. Like, I had to think a lot about what would Sarah have seen, and if I don't have her firsthand accounts, then what might life have looked like? What can I draw, informed conclusions from. There's so much more we need to do.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting because when I was doing my initial research, I was using sort of firsthand documents, diaries and letters from colonists in Trinidad who were sort of writing back to Europe to sort of tell them about, and not just in Trinidad, but the entire West Indies, tell them sort of how things were going, how hot it was, and they were all men. And there's almost no record, at least in what I was seeing, of like women writing back and their stories, and then of course not Black people, right? And so, or any people of color for that matter. And so, and yet the census materials, make it really clear that these people are living there, that they're inhabiting this space, and that they have lives, and that they have interior lives and family lives. And so that was all really, really important, sort of to remember as I was sort of, building this story. But, I wanted to ask you about the West, right? I mean, this idea of the West is so grand, and there are all these sort of bold gestures and lots of sort of masculinity manifested in violence and risk-taking, and yet, I think about how women of the West, and and how it almost feels like their grand risk-taking gestures, because they don't look like a man's grand risk-taking gesture, gets overlooked, right? I mean, like, actually being a woman in the West during this time is huge and so and risky enough, right? And being a Black woman, particularly risky and a real bold gesture, I think. Having children, raising children, cultivating land, which, for food, which is, a big part of your story, a big part of mine. Rosa and Sarah are both kind of women of the land, right? Like they make their own food. And this is a thing that women have been doing since time immemorial, right? And so, and so I think about all these sort of risky enterprises, and, and Sarah loses children. And in this book, you could have, I think, written a very interesting story, just sort of talking about Sarah taking over the water company after her husband dies, and, running that enterprise. But you actually give us all of the backstory and all of her losses and all of her risk-taking from leaving Tennessee to coming out to Montana and building her life there. And I'm just wondering, why it was important for you to put all of that into this story.
Yeah, that's such a wonderful question. And I just have to note, one of the things that isn't talked about really in my book, and you did such a profoundly thoughtful job of making it so apparent, the threats women had to face just to their physical safety, all the threats of rape and all the extra things that women have to think about when they're thinking of, protecting children who are tiny babies from all these external threats, and all the changes that are happening to your body after having a baby, and contending with all of that while you're in this chaotic sort of place. I mean, that it will stay with me for such a long time. So it was so important to me from the beginning to try and tell this, Sarah is a whole complete person, right? She has this whole complete life. And when I went to Virginia City for the first time, and even the first couple of years when I was thinking about maybe I could write a whole book about her, the story was always, she was the Black woman who ran the water company. And that was it. And they really like to bookend her in that way. And it's this is a stunning achievement. She's a Black female public utilities owner in turn of the century Montana. That's incredible. She's probably the only one in the country. I haven't found any other examples. But that wasn't all of her. And she had to go through so much to get there. And so, there were a couple of moments. I went to Tennessee to research her for the first time, and, I remember like just this, bright-eyed like baby grad student walking in being like, hello, I'm looking for information on this woman. She was, I think, a slave. I think this family owned her. Like, this is the extent of what I know. Um, and the archivist just kind of laughing and cringing and being like, oh, sweetie, like, I want to help you, but I don't know how you're going to find any of that. But then there was this moment, I talk about it in my book, the census taker in 1860 in the place that she lived happened to enumerate every Black person in Jonesboro, Tennessee, whether they were slaves or not, on the census. And so I had this little jolt of like, well, the universe meant for me to find this. Because what are the odds that like the person I'm trying to find would actually, right, be in the one place, right, in that area that was the case. So that was a moment where I thought, well, if I can connect her story all the way to Tennessee and tell this whole complete story, that really matters, because sometimes it's very hard to do that. Slavery tries to dislocate people, and it tries to make sure that people don't have roots to their stories. And so, of course, I have to do that if I have an opportunity. But then there was another moment where I was just kind of digging in the newspapers, looking for some things. I was kind of a low point and thinking maybe I found everything I'm going to find about Sarah, and maybe I'll just have to write a good article and do the best I can, but I don't know if I'll be able to get a whole book. And I stumbled across the obituary for her son, for James Leonard, and I didn't note that he was African American. I didn't note any of this other backstory, but he had died on her birthday. Right? He dies the day before her birthday. She's in Montana, pretty much by herself at that point. And that was such a profound moment for me of realizing, like, not only can I tell more about her story that matters, I can give this person back his name, right? I can restore a part of her history in naming one of her children who nobody really knew what his name was up to that point. And that is such a profound statement to me, like history matters, and talking about people like they're whole, complete people matters. So the water company, that's kind of the most straightforward part of her story. Like that's the part we know all the things about because there's the best documentation of it. But all these personal things she had to go through, there's emotion there that is so important.
Yeah. I was, I often say this, that, the facts aren't always the facts for people of color, particularly, right? And, when I stumbled upon Edward Rose, the stories about him were about him being sort of a scoundrel and untrustworthy, and yet year after year, sort of these very wealthy, who are now famous, explorer types, right, were coming to find him so that he could lead them out west. And I kept saying to myself, well, why do you, like, if you don't trust someone, you wouldn't trust them like with your life and your supplies and your, and give him money time and time again. So I started to wonder, like, perhaps this characterization isn't really fair. And it made me think about sort of this. You touch upon this in your book, but at least for my story, my story begins sort of right when the English come, right the year before the English arrive in Trinidad. The Trinidad is a Spanish colony. The English feel like it is a very valuable piece of land to have. The entire West Indies is extremely valuable, but Trinidad, being close to Venezuela, is a very, very good island to have, and it's extremely fertile, right? And so, so the British come, and we sort of find out that there's like this very small, battle, but has huge consequences, because there are people on the island who will now be ruled by, English, by the English, and the English rule very differently than the Spanish. And so this family, Rosa's family, finds out how different and difficult life is under English rule. But there's so many examples of in your book where you give sort of inherent biases, you know, in sort of your research, right? And like wholly unfounded stories or characterizations of people that really seem to reflect sort of the state of mind of people at the time. You know, that there was this sense that if we mention the person's color or race, it's usually the negative. It's usually a negative story, but otherwise, you know, it's not mentioned. If it's and you found that with Sarah in many places, like her race wouldn't actually be mentioned if she was, you know, considered, if it was a good story. Now, when she married her second husband, who's also a white man, you know, her race pops up, and it becomes sort of like a discussion. And, you know, I'm wondering as a historian, if you feel like it's just as simple as sort of the dominant culture sort of, you know, weaving the story and having a go at it. But I'll ask another question. I'll let you answer that. And then I have a follow-up to that question, but go ahead.
I wish I had a more satisfying answer. When I started doing the research for this book, I went in like really expecting that this is what most of the history, right, that we have up to this point says. If people talk about Black people in the West, it's usually in context of wanting to make sure that race is notable because they're identifying to others around them, right, that there's a person here who might look different. And finding that that was not the case with Sarah made me really have to start to question, well, is it unique to her? Is it unique to Virginia City? Or might we find this in other places in the West where just we've overlooked these stories because we didn't know? I started coming across so many more cases in Virginia City the more I researched that there were other people of color there. But you wouldn't know that unless you knew that already as you're trying to research them, right? So it's like many layers. And Virginia City is unique. It's got a newspaper for the whole time that this is happening, and it's got this, you know, economic reason for survival. It's still the county seat of Madison County. It still really matters in that sense that, you know, it's economically and politically and in all those ways engaged. But I have a hard time believing that this is the only place in the entire West that this happened, that there's right, someone who looks like Sarah who's been overlooked in the dominant sources. So I wish I had a better answer. I still don't have a great answer for that. But, you know, your book speaks so profoundly to this too, that race is not one thing, right? Race is complicated and identity is complicated. And the characters in your book bring that forward so beautifully, right? They speak multiple languages. They sometimes have very, right, mixed heritages for a variety of reasons. And even the way that they identify themselves can be really complicated based on the situation. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about some of those complicated, right, places where race means multiple things. And it made me think so much, you know, the British and the Spanish like to show up and be like, haha, we're all civilized, we have a flag, like here's all the things we're gonna do now, where, you know, there are people like Rosa and her family that speak multiple languages, that know how to operate in all these different worlds, and the amount of social awareness and just ability to navigate difficult things that required, you know, makes you really step back and think about, like, how are we defining what's civilized?
Right. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, you know, I think when I first began writing this book, I was thinking about you know, I was thinking about Trinidad originally, and, you know, and how diverse a country it is in terms of, you know, ethnic and racial makeup, how it got that way, you know, beginning with sort of, you know, the colonial powers, but then also, you know, sort of immigration and, you know, migratory efforts. And then it got me thinking about, you know, all the migration that was happening at the time, all the sort of, you know, taking of land, what we call and think of as expansion that's happening. It's happening everywhere. And, we here in America, don't really think about what's happening in sort of China and India at the time, but, there's a lot of movement, and I'm sure that, 500 years from now, people will look at our time as that as well. But we sort of don't think about very often. We seem to be very focused on sort of white male patterns of exploration and expansion, and not everyone else. Like, they aren't the only people moving at this time, right? And whether it's choices, whether they're moving by choice or not, but there's a lot of movement, right? There's enslavement. There's not just enslavement of Africans, there's enslavement of indigenous people all up and down the Caribbean, and and in the Americas, right? And in North America. And so, when you have all of this sort of movement, you are sharing languages, sharing food, sharing cultures. There is, and there's a reason that miscegenation laws came about, because people do that, right? People begin to sort of live and learn to be with one another. And so Rosa's family, her mother is from Martinique, and she's sort of, she's fairer and, more Creole blood. Her father is a direct descendant of an enslaved man. And so there are different languages in this family. There are different complexions, different features, and all of that sort of interplays in this. And when she moves to Montana, Bighorn, and she begins living with the Crows, and she is raising a Crow boy, right? And she's married to Edward Rose, and she's raising this boy who looks Black, but he is being raised in this tribe, and he feels different. He doesn't feel different immediately. He feels different when an outsider comes along and says, "Hey, you are different." So this is their community, and then suddenly this jarring thing happens where she recognizes that sort of outsider coming in and saying, "Hey, something about you doesn't ring true, doesn't ring right," and her instinct is to take her child away. So during this journey is when she begins to tell him all about, or when he sort of discovers all about her past and how. But all of this, and they're moving toward Idaho at this point, and all of that's happening is that we're seeing that her past culture, her past life is sort of blending with the life she's living now, and her son is experiencing completely different. He knows how to speak English and Spanish and French, and also many tribal languages, and so he's very fluid and fluent, and yet his skin color is the thing that she knows is the thing that she knows will hold him back and make his life tougher and harder, despite the fact that, like, she's been trying to protect him from this. So I wanted to sort of add the layers of complexity about sort of race and culture, but also sort of highlight the stagnation of it and the limiting aspect of it. I often think about Osa and how her life could have been really different if she were a white woman, and I know would have been really different if she was a man, right? Just the fact that she came from Trinidad, and I had to actually have an escort, to bring her into North America, because she can't be a Black woman at that time traveling alone, or her whole life would be at risk without a white presenting man near her. So I found it interesting that both of our women sort of ended up in Montana, sort of being escorted by a white male who for all intents and purposes sort of allows that safe travel, that safe passage. So I don't know if that answers your question. I have no idea. So But I will say that, you know, this one question that I had, and I was just thinking about, you quoted, I guess, a historian, Peggy Riley. Is that a historian? Yes. And you said it's often through women's stories that we can better understand the histories of communities. Yet it is exactly these stories that are largely untold. And you also write that it is relatively straightforward to write about the institution of slavery as it is to write about the West, but it's something else again to capture the agency and intricacies of an individual life. And, you know, in both of our stories, I was thinking about how our goal was to sort of highlight this very sort of individual life and not anything that's so extraordinary that, like, you know, and they had extraordinary moments, but, like, you know, but it's the uniqueness of their sort of everyday life that I think makes it so interesting that we're actually talking. You know, I was thinking about Dr. Erica Armstrong, who wrote the story about Ona Judge, who was the enslaved woman who was Washington's President George Washington and Martha's enslaved. Who was the slave of those two people. And I was thinking about, you know, just this whole world that we're living in where there is more, I think, accountability and less hero worshiping. And I wonder, as a historian, if we're coming into a new phase of not just talking about people of color and indigenous people, but highlighting sort of this individuality of lives. And maybe, just maybe, there's a little more space for women who just have sort of everyday experiences, like storytelling about those women. Like, you know, have we finally come to the point where, like, we can actually talk about a Sarah or a Rosa who, you know, who don't do anything like that's so huge that they need monuments, but that they actually are, they lived and survived.
Yeah, and I think it's so important that we do that, especially with Black women's stories, right? If you just go and look for biographies or books about Black women in the West, you'll find kind of the standard, right, handful, and there's really not very many, which is also something that we need to do better at. But it has tended to be for a long time, even as historians got much better at being like, we need to account for diversity in the West, and we need to talk much more about how it's, in the words of Patricia Nelson Limerick, a meeting ground, not just a line of movement in one direction. But the stories that you tend to come across are women who became notorious for one reason or another. So there's Mary Fields out in San Francisco, who there's Mary Ellen Pleasant. Mary Fields is in Montana. Sorry, need more coffee this morning. But Mary Ellen Pleasant in San Francisco, or Mary Fields in Montana, Biddy Mason out in California. And they're women who, like, people take note of because they say, well, look at all these notorious things that they've done. Look at all the waves they've caused. Look at all the rules they've broken, as arbitrary as those might be. And it started to feel more and more like there's a tendency to try to do that with Sarah. You know, we're like, well, look at all the rules she broke. She's the owner of this water company. Like, she's, you know, a total rule breaker. And I felt like it was so important to step out and like, no, like, she was just a woman living her life, doing her thing. Like, she made a decision to be in Montana. She clearly wanted that to be home for much of her life. I have a lot of faith in her. She could have gone somewhere else if she wanted to. You know, she certainly had those capabilities. And it's important to capture that just day to day, you know, the things that made her life what it was. I know, so it's kind of a balance with Sarah. She did do extraordinary things.
Yeah.
But that's not the whole of her life. And it just, again, like, it brings me back to wondering, like, how many more stories are out there that, like, we just don't know about because nobody
wrote them down.
Yeah, Dee Garso talks about this so, like, beautifully in her work on Mary Fields. Mary Fields is the brain. You know, she's a woman who comes to Montana and people are like, oh, she's toting a gun around and she's driving the stagecoach and she's doing all these things that are not ladylike. And that's part of her story, but there's so many other facets to her story that we just don't know about. People didn't ask her about them. People didn't talk about them at the time. Yeah.
All right, so elephant in the room, which let's just talk about it. So I'm Black, and I wrote about a Black woman who lives with Crow Native Americans, and you are a white woman, and you wrote a story about a Black woman. I don't know about you, but I was scared. I was like, oh God, no. But you know, it's funny because the only other choice I had was, you know, I had two choices, right? You don't write the story, or you erase. You like literally just erase. I could have written the story and tried to kind of, you know, skirt around the fact that there were Native Americans in North America, you know, ever, right? And like, you know, I've seen books where people have completely written, you know, about New York City, and there isn't one Black person or one person of color in the entire book. So I know that it could be done, but it just seemed completely disingenuous, and it seemed ridiculous. You know, so for me, you know, my entire goal was to just, you know, just remember what it feels like when I'm reading those stories, and to honor another culture the way that I want mine to be honored. And, you know, and I worked super, super hard to get the details right, to, you know, remove my blind spots, right? Because I grew up on the East Coast. I didn't know that many Crow Native Americans, or any actually. And I had to dig deep, and I had to, you know, ask myself a lot of questions, like where are you getting this idea from? Like, is this rooted in reality about this culture? And so I'm just, you know, I'm curious about sort of whether, you know, you had the same sort of, you know, trepidations and anxieties about writing the other. We know what it means to have to do that and, you know, face the public.
Yeah, I definitely had a lot of anxiety, but that's just normal. It's daily life. But I did, as I was starting to think about this story, I did, you know, pause and just contemplate, like, am I the right person, you know, to tell this story? And one of my advisors had kind of picked up on that, and we were having a conversation about framing this story. And the one thing she said to me that has always stuck with me and that motivated me and still motivates me when I think about, you know, the people I'm researching, she said, you know, I can tell you really care about her.
Right.
And I thought, yeah, you know, that's like, as historians, where, you know, you come up through the academic system being told, like, well, don't get too passionate about your characters because you need to think about, you know, being objective and telling stories objectively and not getting too emotionally invested. And I made a conscious decision where I said, you know, I'm not going to do that. I do care about Sarah, and I really care about the way her story is presented, and I really care about making sure she seems as complex and human and complicated as she is. And that is a little bit of a limb to go out on as a historian. But then I think, like, if we're going to write about real people and if we want people to care, then we have to do that.
That's right. It shows up on paper. Like you can't, you're not writing stories and pretending that you care about someone and think that you're fooling the reader. The reader knows when you admire and care about your characters. Absolutely. I mean, and I saw that in your book, for certain. I actually didn't realize you were white, and I had to go back and look. I was like, oh, well, look at that. That's fantastic. So there you go. So anyway, okay, listen, we're at the 4:45 mark. So I don't know if there are questions, but
it looks like we have some good ones in the chat coming.
Okay, let's see. Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
I've just been typing mine into the chat.
Wonderful.
oh,
But
okay, good.
but I can ask you face to face if you would like. Um, Another question I had that we hadn't kind of got into yet, but you spoke about moving into a time where just living is enough to have a story worth telling, and I love that because I think just living is kind of hard enough, and that we don't need to do anything great. But I was wondering, what stories would you like to tell beyond the ones that you've told um, already? Like, what detailed accounts do you feel are missing from our cultural collection of text? If that makes sense.
So many.
Yeah.
There's so many. I mean, I
Like,
love having these books together side by side and us getting to have this conversation because it really does force us to think a little just like how we tell stories matters, right? Just that fundamental act of telling stories matters. And somewhere like at the end of the day, at the end of everything, we're remembered by our stories, right? We're remembered through stories and the stories we tell, the stories people tell about us. And writing history and writing a novel are really not that different. Like we're both telling a story about a person, right, who did exist or who could have existed. I very much
Yeah.
there was definitely rosas in the West. It's just how we capture those stories.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole genre of westerns that, you know, Western stories that don't include women and definitely don't include people of color, um, and Black women in particular, right? I mean, I can't remember watching one Western, and yet, Laura's book proves that there were people. It's funny because when I began writing this story, I ran into I was at a writer's residency, and a man told me, he kind of pulled me aside and was like, "Hey, do you really know what a Western is?" And he started to sort of ask me about if I'd read, McMurtry and McCarthy. And I was like, yeah, I read that. And I was so silly. Like I had no idea that like he was questioning whether or not I could and should be writing a Western. Like it was almost like he owned that. And,
yeah.
and I was so stunned. It wasn't until I was going back to sort of my cabin that I realized, oh, that's what was happening. Right. Um, but there is this idea that the West belongs to only one small group of people, and and it's not even indigenous people, right? Like, and there's just this whole idea. If it was any group, it would be indigenous people, but it isn't even that, and I think that just questioning that will lead us to so many other stories, so many uncovered truths, or covered truths, so I think just challenging the assumption that that one place, Montana, belongs to any one person. Just we should do that more.
Yeah, no, that's great. And then we have a question of, who are some other contemporary authors writing about overlooked and marginalized histories that you would recommend?
Yeah. So let's think. I love Louise Erdrich. I love Joy Harjo. Natalie Diaz is a poet. I love her stuff, set in the West as well. Um, Percival Everett is a Black male writer, and he's written something. Actually, I think he wrote one story that's set in either Wyoming or Montana. I'm sorry, I can't remember, but it's just a real fun, interesting Western that, like, it's a Black man who owns some land, and I just love reading that story. And many of his books are set in the West, and so I think there's a lot of people doing this work.
I think there's a really good growing awareness, and it has been for a while, like that we need to write more stories of diverse people in the West. Like Shirley Ann Wilson Moore just had a book come out about Black overlanders on the Overland Trail, for example. So they're out there, they're growing, like we're starting to add to this literature. I'm super humbled that I get to add Sarah to this literature, like, and I just like consider that such a, you know, a privilege. So it's happening. There's a great question right now about if there's a chance of a TV show or a movie, and like, yes, please, like, go leave all the good reviews of both of our books so we can make that happen. These are both movie stories. One of my dreams, y'all, was to go on Drunk History and talk about Sarah, because they did some amazing work early on with like elevating stories, like Sally Hemings, and stories that just like really need to be talked about more in the mainstream. Utterly devastated that Drunk History has been canceled.
It's gone.
You could start like a spin-off. I don't know how without, you know, copyright infringement or like whatever, you know, like, but yeah, think about that.
Sober stories. We could do sober
stories. Yeah. You could. Another question from Brian Hosmer. Sorry, Brian.
Hi, Brian.
He says, wonderful conversation, so wide-ranging and interactive. My compliments to you both. I'd like to return to something you both mentioned at the outset. These people as women of the land. Can you elaborate a bit more on what that meant to both of you as you developed your narratives?
That's such a... I'm going to toss this one to Lauren, because one of my most favorite passages of this book, and there were many, and also before I forget, thank you for letting Martinique the horse live, because I was really worried about that the whole time, and I just want to let you know that I really appreciate that.
I couldn't kill off Martinique.
Thank you. No, but there's a really beautiful passage at the end where Victor is contemplating all of the things he's learned and all of the knowledge he's having to incorporate into how he sees the world. And he talks about home as a collection of experiences, right? That home is not just one place that you're from. Home is all the things that shape you. And I think that resonates with me on a really, like, you know, deep level. I think it would have resonated with Sarah. She's born in Tennessee. She chooses to spend her life in Montana. And part of, for me, capturing why she chooses to promote this legacy of the vigilantes is that that's a sense of agency over her story. She identifies as a Westerner and a Montanan, and I think she had reasons for why that story mattered. And so I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about coming to that. I mean, it's really profound and beautiful conclusion that home is this whole collection of your life and not one place.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that. I think that I think being a child of sort of dual identities in certain respects. You know, I grew up in a home with two parents who did not grow up in America. You know, I'm American born, and yet I was sort of by osmosis, maybe just living their stories, their childhood, and you know, by what they gave me. And you know, I wrote my first book was largely based on my grandmother's story, and you know, coming to America, and much of what I kind of knew about Trinidad was sort of based on 35 years of listening to my parents talk. And you know, and when my parents talk about home, they, you know, when I hear the word home, I know exactly that they're talking about Trinidad, and yet that's not my home, right? And yet I feel this incredible pull connection to it, and so I you know, and so there's so much that makes us, right? And you know, we're Italian and Irish, and our great grandparents' history, and you know, there's all rich for it, and this country is so rich for it, and I really wanted to to emphasize, how important it was for us to sort of embrace all the varied parts of ourselves. But to answer Brian's question, when I mentioned sort of the land and women of the land, my goal when I was writing this was not to write a story about rugged individualism and, a fight with the land, right? In sort of that sort of traditional Western way. My goal was to write about community. Rosa moves to Montana and she builds community. Rosa lives in Idaho and there's community. Rosa is in Trinidad and she comes from a place of people and all of that informs her. And the land is something that is loved in my story and your story, right? And this sense that like we have a place, but also that this place will provide for us. And so we dig in the soil and we plant and we grow things, and it is a love of community, and that includes the nature, the natural land around us.
I think that's.
Are you still there? Did I lose everybody?
No,
okay, good.
No, I think that's great. We're all here. We're just taking it in, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do think, and Brian said, great, thanks.
Thank you, Brian.
I don't believe we have any additional questions, so we'll go ahead and kind of move forward with wrapping this up. Is there any last comments that you guys would like to share with us, or?
I'd love to know what Lauren's working on next.
Oh, funny, I was going to ask you that.
Perfect, and that's a great way to wrap it up.
I'm working on a book set in my hometown of Baltimore. It's another historical novel. It's not going so well though, so I'm gonna not talk about it that much because it's such a struggle. And we'll see what comes of this. But it's set in the early sort of 1919, which is a big time in this country's history. Particularly for African Americans, and sort of 1919, 1920. So yeah. But I was going to ask you, Laura, about your next project. And I'm curious if it's another sort of gap filling project or something else.
It is, yeah. I have two, and they're both gap filling in really different ways. So Sarah had a daughter who ended up living in Oklahoma, and I happen to have also ended up inadvertently in Oklahoma. And her daughter was basically the secretary for a man named James Cootie Johnson, who was an Afro Creek person. He was an interpreter for the Seminole tribe. He's a fascinating individual, and I'm really fascinated by the connections between them. So I'm hoping to do some work on one of Sarah's daughters and all the connections that she had in Oklahoma. They had organized a series of all Black state fairs in the 19-teens. And so that is very interesting to me that we're both now working on the 19-teen era. We've moved out of the Wild West and into the 20th century.
Yeah, I read that, and I actually highlighted that entire section because it was so interesting to me. I had never heard of anything like that, and so I'm so excited to hear.
I'm so excited too, and it's just there's all these profound. Sometimes I think the universe kind of sends you where it needs you to go to tell the stories you need to tell. I've been humbled enough to be allowed to do some work for the Vernon AME Church in Tulsa recently, which was the only Black-owned structure left standing after the Tulsa Massacre in 1921. Mm-hmm. We're approaching the 100-year marker of that. And I have just come across a little bit of evidence that perhaps Sarah's daughter had become a member of that church later in her life. So having the opportunity to step into this space where someone you're writing about was, that is a powerful moment. And then I just think about, right, you know, tiny white girl from California ending up in the middle of Oklahoma. Like, what are the chances, right? The universe would put me right in that specific place. And I hope it's because on some cosmic level, you know, I care about Sarah and all of the things that happened to, right, the ends of her story through her children, that maybe I can bring some of that out. I'm also going to be getting to work on another book about my family's history. My family was Italian and Portuguese immigrants, and we never talked about it. Like, I grew up having no sense of roots or where my family had come from. And that to me is another kind of fascinating part of this story. Like, people who visually look white inventing themselves to look even more white because they want to fit in this part of the West. Like, there's more to talk about there. So I've been thinking a lot about this idea of home, and why that struck so deeply. Like, you captured that so well.
Thank you. Thanks. Some fascinating projects. I'm really excited to hear these. Yeah.
I feel like we're going to have to do another book talk on our new books, because they're also set in the same time period.
I know.
Yeah. Yes, you can do that here. We will gladly have you back. We'll put it on the calendar. I know it's like we don't have release dates yet, but as soon as you do, let us know, because we would love to have you back. So.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. I'm so pleased. Really so nice.
Yeah. Well, it's been our pleasure. This was a wonderful discussion. Thank you to both of you, to Laura J. Arata and Lauren Francis Sharma. It's been a pleasure, and congratulations on Race in the Wild West, Sarah Bickford, and the Construction of Historical Memory in Virginia City, Montana, 1870 to 1930, and Book of the Little Axe. Thank you again to our sponsors, the Whitefish Review, and thank you to everyone watching and participating. You've been great, and I'm glad to read all the comments that you enjoyed the conversation. Just as a reminder, you can purchase both of these books by these authors, as well as many of our other authors, at Fact and Fiction's website, factandfictionsbooks.com. I also urge you to purchase Montana Book Festival merchandise at montanabookfestival.com. There you can also donate so that we can continue our programming after the festival with our MBF Plus events and get these wonderful women back in the future. Anyway, thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Great weekend. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.